Welcome everybody on behalf of Rare Disease Social Research Center at the Polish Academy of Sciences. We are very pleased to have Professor Amy Chandler and Dr. Baptiste Brossard with us today. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We waited for this lecture of yours for a very long time. And before I give the floor to both of you, to our speakers, I wanted to shortly introduce both of the speakers for those who don't know them. So Amy Chandler is a professor of sociology of health and illness at the University of Edinburgh. And she's a sociologist specializing in sociology of health and illness with a particular focus on suicide, self-harm, mental health, and substance use. And Dr. Baptiste Brossard is a lecturer of sociology at the University of York and a sociologist currently working in the areas of critical mental health and historical sociology. Amy and Baptiste, if I may, will present their last book today. The book is entitled Explaining Mental Illness, Sociological Perspectives. It was published in 2022 with Bristol University Press. And at this point, I just wanted to pay a little tribute to the authors and say that I really highly recommend reading this book to our participants if you haven't read it yet. It is truly an impressive synthesis of contemporary sociological theories of mental illness and an attempt to think beyond them. In my opinion, when I read the book, I had an impression that the authors did really a tremendous amount of work in terms of literature review, and the reader really has an impression that the critic is very well informed and comprehensive. And also the style is very satisfying and refreshing. It's a very good reading, and many times I was like, wow, these sentences are just beautiful, like thick yet clear. And it's really carefully crafted in terms of language with forceful images. And it has this kind of intense flow. So to me, it's an academic writing done with like full engagement of the mind and the heart. And I'm really very grateful that you agreed to talk to us today. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Berta.
Thank you so much. I don't know how we're going to live up to that introduction, but it's much appreciated. Yeah, just thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad we got there in the end. I know it's been a bit of a wait to manage with our schedules and so on. I'll wait for Baptiste to start the slideshow.
Do you see the slides? Yes.
The minute it's still like the kind of notes view.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I think if you just go to the top left and do.
Yeah, but it should be. So wait, I will redo it again because I might have not shared the right. Oh, okay. I shared my screen and not the software. Okay. Okay, is it okay like that?
Still showing the notes for me. I don't know.
Really?
I think it's if you don't mind the audience seeing the the content, I think it's okay. Yeah.
It's still the notes.
Have you got two screens, Baptiste?
It could yes. Be maybe so. Just
paying to do that. Yeah.
Okay. How do? Okay, I think I need to change the screen. Okay. Like this.
Yes, that's it.
All
Perfect.
right. Okay.
Nice. Okay,
Sorry
cool.
about that.
Right. Excellent. Right, let's get going. I'll just give you a nod when I need a slide change. So,
Sure.
thank you again for the warm introduction. And as Beata has said, I'm Amy Chandler. I'm going to do the first part of the presentation today, and we're really going to sort of take you through a whistle-stop tour of some of the main themes that we cover within the book. But rather than trying to summarize the entire book, which whenever I try and think about doing that makes me really panicky because there's a lot, and we do pack quite a lot into it. We're focusing in particular on a kind of theme that we address in the conclusion of the book, which is around this notion of a mental health crisis and what sociology and sociologists might be able to do in terms of helping to explain mental illness, in particular in this time that we are perhaps allegedly living in, which is a time of mental health crisis. Sociology, as we argue in the book, and many others agree, has a huge amount to say about mental health. However, certainly in the UK, I'd be really interested to hear if this is similar in Poland and elsewhere. But certainly in the UK, when we have public conversations about mental health, so when issues around a mental health crisis, for instance, or issues around suicide, my particular area of interest, are covered on the media, on TV, or in newspapers, the academics or kind of experts that are brought in are largely psychologists and psychiatrists. So although sociology has been interested in mental health for many, many years, and there's lots of activity in that kind of field of work, we don't tend to be the go-to people. So this underlines, though, I think, the importance of a sociological response. And one of the kind of reasons that we wrote the book was in part to kind of try to underline what sociology can add to not just understanding and thinking about mental health and mental illness, but also explaining it and looking at kind of social causes of mental illness, which again, sociology has a lot to say about. So in our presentation today, then, as I said, we're going to summarize some of the main themes of our book, Explaining Mental Illness, Sociological Perspectives, which was indeed published last year. But through this lens of discourse about a current and indeed ongoing crisis of mental health. We discuss not only the notion of crisis as a discourse, but we're also going to consider through this some of the empirical basis on which this idea about a crisis is based and how we might understand and explain it through sociological means. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So in terms of the broad history, we've got one slide on the history of the sociology of mental illness. So forgive me, this is superficial. Sociology and mental health have got a long history. Indeed, the kind of very early kind of like emergence of the discipline of sociology and going forward, mental health has often played a kind of really key role in this. So we see this in Emil Durkheim's Suicide, and then later Irving Goffman's work on both asylums and also stigma. And yet, despite the kind of central place of mental health within the development of the discipline of sociology, what we observe and argue has occurred in recent years, and that others such as Avis and colleagues agree, is that over kind of like latter half of the 20th century, the sociology of mental health has become a kind of peripheral and more specialized topic. So rather than being central to what sociology as a discipline is doing and thinking about, mental health has increasingly been a kind of subspecialism within medical sociology, so the sociology of mental health and illness. So what we, as well as Montana and colleagues who have a chapter in the book Mental Health and Social Mirror, which was published a few years ago now, but what we both argue is that the sociology of mental health might be more properly seen as deeply entwined with sociology as a whole, and that actually in the 21st century, sociologists would do well to engage with that sort of centrality more fully. In the book, as we kind of work through the different chapters and come to the final conclusion where we suggest that sociology has much to say about the crisis of mental health, we kind of bring some of these threads together by arguing that sociology of mental health really should be at the center of, it really is just the sociology of everything. We'll try and talk through that. So next slide, thank you. So I've referenced then this notion of crisis, but what are we talking about here? And again, this is something that I'd be really interested in the discussion and the Q&A to hear about whether or not in Poland and other places that you may be aware of, whether this kind of crisis narrative is familiar or not. Certainly in the UK, and we see it in also kind of other policy documents. So we've looked in particular at some policy documents in the US, which we look at in the book. And also for this particular presentation and some associated writing, we've looked at the way that the World Health Organization, or the WHO, makes use of the notion of crisis in some of its kind of primary publications around mental health. So the idea of a mental health crisis is an expression that we are seeing as being increasingly commonly used to describe the high and often seen as increasing prevalence rates of most mental disorders, mental illnesses, either in particular countries, so we have national reports which will focus on this crisis of mental health within a particular national context, or as with the WHO documents and others, an argument that this is a global mental health crisis. Now, when we're thinking about this, I think it is really important to look at the way that crisis is working here and working as a narrative. It is a way of kind of structuring and understanding and making sense and telling a story about what people's experiences are about. But at the same time, certainly within our own work, we're absolutely not dismissing the serious amounts of distress and disorder and difficulty that people are facing. So in our work, and indeed in many others, we seek to kind of really just avoid this idea of between essentialism and constructionism, that suggest and argue instead that the mental health crisis can be understood as both a social construction, but also very much as a reality that people are living through. So while the mental health kind of crisis might be understood as a discourse alone, we would argue that this is a really simplistic way of looking at it, and that actually at the same time as seeing it as a discourse, we can also see that serious amounts of people are claiming to, and indeed experiencing, behavioural troubles, emotional distress, whilst at the same time this is supported by a dynamic and changing web of institutions that monitor, define, and then seek to respond to this suffering. So another aspect of crisis when we're thinking about mental health, though, of course, is its kind of dual use. So we're going to be focusing kind of mostly on this idea that it is a crisis of society, that something is going wrong or awry with society to lead to these extremely high levels of mental health problems. So these high percentage rates, this is a UK-based survey, looking at the number of UK adults who've experienced mental health issues and finding that the majority of people are experiencing these. So this is seen as, a big social problem. At the same time, crisis is, of course, often used to describe an individual mental health crisis. And so the word crisis within mental health has these kind of double meanings. It's important also, though, to think about what the word and the narratives and the discourses around crisis are doing, what function they have. So there have been, and there continue to be, kind of concerns or critiques about the notion of crisis and the way it's used. So a crisis tends to kind of elicit an idea that something is a recent, an urgent kind of thing that requires kind of a quick response, and it's something that is new and novel. However, in some of my own work looking at the crisis of masculinity in relation to the crisis of male suicide, with my colleague Anna Jordan, we've looked more critically at the way that this crisis narrative is used to kind of suggest that something like high rates of male suicide are new, urgent, and require a really quick and big response, where actually these kinds of concerns about both masculinity and high rates of male suicide are, centuries old, actually. And since the first statistics were gathered around suicide, male suicide rates have been high. So the way that crisis is used is absolutely something that we should be cautious with and question. Okay, next slide. So another reason that it is important to think about the way that crisis is being framed and the effects that it might have is that the way that crisis is framed and understood has real effects on how it is then responded to. So when we're thinking about trying to explain mental health and mental illness, we're also looking then at what those kinds of explanations invite in terms of particular types of responses. So similarly, when we're thinking about mental health as something that is a crisis, then that elicits particular types of responses, which as sociologists, we're really interested in looking at. So we focused in particular on a particular publication by the World Health Organization, which is the 2023 World Mental Health Report. And within this, there is frequent mention of the word crisis. So there is understood to be a mental health crisis, rising rates of mental illness, and crucially for the WHO, a deficit in terms of the services and supports that are available for people. So the responses that the WHO proposes in response to the crisis is that we improve access to mental health services and ensure that they are effective, and also to support charities, non-governmental organisations, and launch public health promotion campaigns which focus on getting people to seek help. So the focus is very quite narrowly on dealing with the kind of like immediate mental health crises that people may be facing. It's a focus on the psychological management of social suffering, whether that's on an individual level or through accessing services, which should be expanded and increased. However, there is a tendency, though, within this to draw on these more psychological or individual notions of responding to the crisis as a way of kind of concealing the way that mental health may be shaped and indeed explained or caused by other social or cultural issues. And so in our own work, then, we try to focus on these social and cultural issues as a way of trying to explain the crisis and providing an alternative or different type of narrative to that proposed by, for instance, the World Health Organization. So in the next part of the talk, I'm going to pass over to Baptiste, who's going to cover the two of the broad ways in which sociology has sought to explain mental illness. And we're going to focus in particular on mental illness in relation to this crisis. So looking at social positions and stress, and then I'll cover the two other ones that we look at, which is labels and culture. So over to you, Baptiste.
Thank you, Amy. Hi, everyone. So I'm Baptiste Brossard. So yes, the book basically is structured in 4 chapters, and each chapter is designed to represent a reasoning by which sociologists or social scientists aim at explaining the emergence of mental disorders. So that's how we proceeded in our literature review. We try to identify core reasonings. And the first reasoning that we identify is related to the relation between mental health and inequalities, or mental health inequalities. So that's what I'm going to talk first. Mental health inequalities are very well known and very well researched right now. We know, and most public policies are well informed about the fact that mental health difficulties are correlated with economic status, socioeconomic status, so social class, gender, race, age, place of residency, and so forth and so forth. So it is now a very clear set of results that we have. In the book, we are retracing the history of this idea, how the idea that there are some inequalities, some social inequalities of mental health have appeared. For instance, with Durkheim and his studies on the suicide, or Faris and Dunham on mental illnesses in Chicago in the 30s. And we try to identify some trends in this history. And so one of these important trends, I think, is a shift from community studies to population studies. From the 30s up to the 60s, 70s, the main ways of evidencing mental health inequalities was to do community studies, meaning studies focused on one community, like a city or a district or a neighborhood, and then measuring in different ways how various indicators of mental distress would be correlated with some indicators of social position. And especially from the 80s onwards, population studies have been privileged, meaning studies that are considering a wider range of populations, like a representative sample of a country, in order to identify more solid statistical correlations, but sometimes at the price of more generic indicators of either mental health or social position. In this chapter, we also talk about the different debates that have existed and that still exist on the explanations of these correlations. For instance, one of the main opposition that took place for some time was between what was called the selection hypothesis and the causality hypothesis. Because one interpretation of this correlation between mental health and social position is that mental health issues are provoking some decline in social position, because people affected with mental health issues are less abilities to work and to build relations. Therefore, there are mental health inequalities because of this process. So this is the selection hypothesis. But on the other side, the causality hypothesis advances, or at least the proponents of the causality hypothesis advance that mental illnesses, mental health issues themselves were caused by social position. For instance, poor life conditions or deprivation would lead to experience some mental illness. So today, there is a sort of consensus for once that these two processes are intertwined, and there is both a causality process and a selection process at stake in the relation between mental health and social position. So we tried to delve into the ways in which in the literature mental health inequalities are understood and explained. And we've distinguished between 5 types of explanation. So I put this on the slide. It's a bit full on for one slide. But anyway, there is the cultural behavioral explanations, which consider that socialization, lifestyles that differs depending on social position, shape mental health experiences, and ultimately the lifestyle. So we are trying here, in the way in which we are summarizing these processes, we are trying to account for this very complex process in which life conditions are creating some mental health experiences, which are creating some life condition, and it's going as a sort of cycle. So there are more materialist explanations that are focused on material conditions of life, which contributes, for instance, to explain why poor people who lack shelters and food are more prone to experience some mental distress. Social role / support explanations, considering that people hold unequal quantities and qualities of social roles and ties and connections, which impacts their mental health, which impact their social network. Stress explanations, on which I'll get back in a few minutes, and artifact explanations, which consider that there is also an issue in labeling here, meaning that depending on their social position, people experience and express their emotions in different manners, which impact the diagnosis they receive. So there is probably also a labeling effect in our knowledge of mental health inequalities. So, as I said at the beginning, we are quite confident in saying that mental health intertwines with social inequalities. However, in the book, we also advance that this relation might be less straightforward than expected. Most of the research in mental health inequalities evidence mental health inequalities in establishing correlations, right? Mostly in quantitative surveys. So correlating, for instance, socioeconomic status with this or that mental disorder, all right? And we know that, for instance, people who have less income, they are more likely to have depression. People who are, we know that women are more likely to have depression, etc., etc. So these are correlations. But we also advance in this book that drawing correlations, what we call the correlation paradigm, because it's such a big deal, is not sufficient, because correlations don't show with enough complexity how social inequalities intertwine with mental health. And drawing on the literature, we have tried to identify 3 emerging trends that we consider to be alternatives to this correlation paradigm. Intersectional perspectives, which you probably already heard about. They consist of considering different variables of social position and showing that these intersections have a specific meaning in social life. So maybe I'm not very clear here, but basically it means that, for instance, if you are a white gay woman, then it's different to only have certain variables combined with one another, but it's a specific identity with specific effect, with specific types of power and oppression associated to that. So that's intersectional perspectives. Configurational perspectives, there are the works that study social position as configuration, as a configuration of, for instance, family members, networks, friendship networks as well, and that make social position something very complex on the basis of who people are connected with and who in what different groups they evolve. And definitional perspectives, we call definitional perspective these approaches that explain that finally mental disorders, in the very way in which they are defined, they capture some specific populations, and they in this regard, the way in which mental disorders are defined, the very way in which mental disorders are defined, target certain populations and do something to mental health inequalities. We have an example in the book. It's the book from Laura Hirschbein, who works on the history of depression, who is talking about the genesis of the category of depression and how it has been designed originally in the late 19th century to really talk about housewives, so women who are basically bored at home, doing nothing, and I mean, not nothing, but not having much activities, sorry about that. Lacking opportunities is what I meant. And she shows how finally this disorder, depression, was framed as a womanly disorder, which created a sort of spiral, which was in the sense that it was defined through symptoms and criteria that would capture more the suffering of women. And finally, it's a self-sufficient spiral that makes depression a womanly disorder up to today. So I hope it was clear enough. Don't hesitate to ask more questions at the end. And we think that these alternative conceptualizations of mental health inequalities, which are complexifications in many ways, unable to better understand what we call the mental health crisis. Because we can consider that the mental health crisis is in many ways associated with inequality, with social inequalities. And as a matter of fact, it's really evidenceable with statistical surveys. For instance, it's very clear that following COVID, in many countries, there have been studies that show an increase of mental distress in many countries in the world, but this increase is much higher in disadvantaged populations. There has been an increase. I think in the UK, it's like twice as much in the working class than in the middle class or something like that, but it's very significant trend that we can identify. So this is for the correlation part of mental health inequalities, but we can also think a bit further about mental health inequalities and the mental health crisis in terms of inequalities in applying these three alternative conceptions of mental health inequalities. For instance, about intersections, we can consider that the mental health crisis manifests a collective problem with identity differences, in which some intersections ultimately lead people to be more affected by power dynamics, oppression, and the suffering associated to that. The configurational perspective can lead us to imagine that there might be a multiplication of composite configurations that place people within multiplying, contradictory, or overwhelming expectations. And definition processes can suggest that there is a rising match between multiplying and changing psychiatric categories and their equivalent in terms of social position. All right, so it was a lot to say in not a lot of time, so don't hesitate to ask more questions at the end, of course. Let's now go to the second part of the of this talk. So the second reasoning that we identified, the second way in which sociologists try to explain mental distress, with the concept of stress. So the stress paradigm, what we call the stress paradigm, the studies of stress, is one of the main approaches to mental health in contemporary sociology since the 90s, I think. It especially comes from the US. It's a very US-centric trend. So I don't know to what extent you know these types of work in the room, but basically most of the stress paradigm studies, they consist of statistical surveys, even if they are qualitative studies as well, using models such as the one I show on the slide, where you have some vision of the etiology of mental disorders, in which some stressful events, some life events, as it is showed here, some stressors of many different kinds. So stressors can be car accident, they can be poverty, they can be, I mean, anything stressful, basically. When stressors are stressing people, and when this stress is not coped with by sufficient resources, then it can lead to some mental distress, conducive to some mental disorders. And there are like a lot of studies that are exploring this this set of concepts with stats mostly. It also has to be noted that stress is also a cultural phenomenon, in the sense that it's a very widespread, what we call idiom of distress in anthropology, that gave rise to an industry, and here I'm really referring to this work from historian Jackson, who published a book in 2013, The Age of Stress, where it shows that stress is both a scientific concept that emerged and developed through academia, but also that became a widespread cultural notion, especially, for instance, if you think of all the companies and services today that are promoting themselves as helping to relieve stress. So to get back to the stress paradigm, in the book, we are quite critical of this paradigm for several reasons. And I put the three main reasons for me. I don't know if you agree, Amy. I think there are 5 or 6 reasons in total, but I mean, they are my favorite ones. Universalism. The stress paradigm relies on the idea that stress is a term that captures this form of pressure or concern or worry in all contexts in the world. So you have works on stress anywhere with any kind of population. Methodological reductionism, as I showed, and you have also another typical graph that is present in stress paradigm publications. Most studies of stress, they consist of taking some complex realities and putting them into very specific categories, like the one you have on the slide. And we know that simplification is a necessity for theorization, but we basically think it's a bit too much here, that we need a bit more complexity to really account for, you know, what suffering is in social life. And finally, we also criticize the conservative implicit ideology that underpins the stress paradigm publications, in the sense that in these publications, the message is that anything stressful is potentially dangerous for people. Because it makes them suffer and it makes them find a resource to cope with things. Whereas we can also consider that social change, and sometimes social change is, it depends on what our values are, but sometimes social change can be positive. Social change is stressful as well. And so saying that we need to avoid stress at all price and in all situations is conservative in the sense that it says we should never change because it's too stressful. In the book, we propose still to build on the insights of this paradigm, but let's say to rechannel it towards other directions. The first direction that we point to is to better account for inequalities and how what we call stress is embedded in social divides, social inequalities, social distinctions. We discussed the notion of minority stress. I don't know if you heard about that concept. It's quite interesting. It says that finally people from the minorities or racial or sexual minorities are experiencing not only more stress, but a specific type of stress, which leads to further elaborations. And also, we propose to consider that stress is an umbrella term for many emotions. And so I put you a map of emotions on the screen. That's this kind of map that is sometimes used in therapy, actually. And that we could study more systematically, as sociologists of emotions already do, actually. We can study more systematically how emotions are produced and framed, and potentially stressful, of course. But we consider that focusing on emotions, on specific emotions, might be more productive and might be more relevant to unpack what is at stake in what the proponents of the stress paradigm calls stress. So to conclude on this point, we can consider that the mental health crisis results from a change in the unequal production of stressful emotions. And we could study what make people stress. So this includes work conditions, forms of management, cost of life, social aspirations, etc. How social domination generates emotions, social justice issues, inequalities, everyday hierarchies, etc. And how these emotions are culturally framed, how social movements channel collective anger, or how therapies and drugs attenuate feelings of anxiety. And we think that this way of reframing the study of stress and turning it into the study of domination and emotions is more complex, so it's more productive from a theoretical perspective, but it's also more respectful of what people experience and of the meanings they give to their emotion. It would be, so I just put this picture of a protest, because there are some works on how anger is framed and channeled in social movements. Well, it's reductive to assimilate all kinds of anger as a form of stress. For instance, if you talk about anger and how it is socially managed, and how, for instance, social movements use it, and how some public authorities try to manage it, it's much more comprehensive as a way to understand how emotions can turn eventually into distress and into mental disorders. So that's all for me for now.
Okay, so I'm going to try and summarize the other two chapters, which each kind of attempts to draw together two other forms of reasonings or explanations that sociologists have put forward to explain mental illness more generally, and then to think about it specifically in the context of this notion of crisis. So the third kind of substantive chapter in the book looks at labels, labeling theories, and the kind of expansion, use and effects of different diagnostic categories around mental illness, or different ways of labeling or naming mental illness. So in terms of thinking about this around crisis, one way of kind of, reorienting what we think about when we're thinking about a kind of, a crisis of mental illness, which is, we're having increased numbers of people who are either self-reporting or being identified and treated as having a mental illness. One way of looking at this, which some sociologists such as Alan Horwitz might kind of advocate, is that this is an expansion of mental health categories, both formally and informally, leading to a proliferation of labels. And this is especially within kind of critical mental health and other kind of critical spaces, is an increasingly kind of well-worn argument around the expansion of psychiatry and kind of medical labeling for different types of distress or stress. So it kind of offers somewhat of an alternative to the stress paradigm and the dominance of that we see within sociology, but to look at it in a more kind of biomedical sphere, where a range of different types of emotions, such as anger, for instance, which may have political motivations and indeed political effects, are kind of drawn in and framed as disorder, something that needs treating, not something that should be, perhaps allowed to cause social change by any means. So the idea that we might understand the crisis of mental health then as a crisis, as one of labelling and psychiatric expansion, is one that sociologists and others have argued for some time. Particularly, we see this, for instance, Alan Horwitz's work on the medicalisation of sadness and grief, and other work that's looked at the way in which, over time, the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, published by the American Psychiatric Association, which has long, far-reaching effects outside of the United States, has, incorporated more and more labels year on, each time it is published and revised, to cover arguably more and more allegedly normal experiences. Again, this speaks to the importance of a sociology of mental health in paying attention to these shifts and moves, and suggests that, again, a sociology of mental health is really a sociology of everything. If we pop to the next slide, please. So within the book, we summarise and draw on and seek to kind of, to some extent, reinvigorate some classical labelling theories in sociology, particularly through the work of Thomas Sheff, which highlights the role and importance of, this is my typo, of labels, not label, in shaping the experiences and possibilities of mental illness. This takes seriously the effects of expansions in psychiatric labelling and the availability of novel identities, treatments, and ways of living. But in terms of thinking about classical labelling theories, one of the kind of ways in which these theories are sometimes misinterpreted and misunderstood is to suggest that these labels are somehow kind of sort of imaginative creations that then kind of give, are then imposed on people, causing these effects. However, in their kind of original and some of the better uses of their of labelling theories, they look much more carefully at the way in which labels are, which seek to kind of identify abnormal and non-normative behaviours or experiences or feelings, are closely entwined with the social contexts in which they emerge. So although they may be kind of legitimated by psychiatry and so on, they don't emerge solely and on their own from psychiatry. Increasingly, approaches to thinking about labelling and the expansion of kind of psychiatry and mental illness as ways of understanding and making sense of difficult or disordered or problematic experiences, whether those are emotional or behavioural, also speaks to the increasing importance of self-labelling and self-diagnosis, each of which was already present in classical labelling theories in sociology, such as work by Thomas Sheff. The early stages of kind of processes of labelling in terms of mental illness in Sheff's work was around people identifying problems in themselves or in family members before then seeking help. As we've moved through the 20th and into the 21st century, of course, the way in which self-labelling and self-diagnosis is able to play out has changed really quite substantially with the advent of the internet. In a very simplistic way, people have much more access now to being able to read the DSM-5, being able to look up different kind of ways of understanding and making sense of themselves. And there are, through social media, there are increasingly ways in which people can access others talking about their experiences of having or living with a particular diagnosis or label. And then they may recognise themselves and take on that label, even in the complete absence of an official psychiatric diagnosis. And indeed, In the UK, for instance, just to take one of the often used examples around the expansion of psychiatric diagnoses, and that is ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. In the region where I live, and I spend a lot of time doing my research working with people experiencing mental illness and distress, the average waiting list for getting a diagnosis of ADHD as an adult is about 8 years. So there is a real kind of tension, I think, sometimes in terms of how the expansion of psychiatry and the dominance of psychiatry is framed, in contrast to the lived experiences of people who are identifying with those diagnoses, seeking support, and kind of having that rejected in some ways. So there's a much more kind of complex picture. And again, it speaks to, we would suggest, the continued importance of labelling theories within the sociology of mental health and illness, despite these having fallen somewhat out of favour in the kind of latter half of the 20th century. So if we can move on to the next slide. So another, oh, not that one, back. Thank you. So another aspect that we seek to kind of draw out in terms of thinking about labelling and labels around mental illness is to connect these with political, economic and cultural dynamics. And again, to really seek to shift this away from it being a kind of straightforward and relatively simplistic critique of psychiatric dominance, to look more carefully at the way in which particular labels might emerge in particular contexts, and how these different kind of labels, ways of making sense and understanding difficult or problematic experiences can be tied to really significant kind of shifts in political contexts, and increasingly in ecological contexts. So we see this through novel kind of diagnostic or proposed diagnostic diagnoses, such as eco-anxiety, anxieties around climate change, with many people starting to self-identify as experiencing eco-anxiety, some therapists treating people experiencing eco-anxiety. But we cannot see this solely as a kind of something that is just about psychiatric domination and the expansion of categories to understand normal responses. We have to understand this is also entwined and entangled with an ongoing climate disaster, which itself is something that is materially happening. And again, for many people in many parts of the world is present in terms of significant actual disasters like massive fires and flooding and so on. So in terms of kind of the way that sociology may take forward labelling theories and thinking about the importance and relevance of labels in relation to mental health and illness, and particularly in terms of this idea of a crisis, it's important then that we take seriously the role of these changing political contexts in shaping people's experiences, the labels that we might give to those experiences, but also crucially their availability to people. A second aspect in terms of thinking about labelling is about considering the effects that these have on people's experiences and self-identities. So we can think about this in terms of the expansion, perhaps slower than in other areas, of notions such as neurodiversity or mad pride, where we have not quite differently from the kind of psychiatric dominance and kind of proliferation of psychiatric labels for mental illness, mental distress. We have activist challenges to the meanings and indeed especially the stigmas that are often associated with mental illness, arguing that these are different ways of being and being in the world, that they bring what Diana Rose has argued to be the importance of mad knowledges that are valuable in their own right. They offer important critiques onto social, political, economic and ecological contexts and should be kind of brought into this. And this again kind of like shifts the picture a bit about ideas and concerns about a crisis of mental health and increasing kind of categories of diagnosis and increasing numbers of people identifying as having mental illnesses, to query whether or not that is necessarily a bad thing. Finally, what we raise in terms of the kind of theories around labelling and their relationship to a crisis is around the entanglement of the diagnostic or official diagnoses and labels with bureaucratic structures. And this helps, we think, to understand why, one of many reasons why diagnostic labels and people self-identifying and taking on these diagnostic labels may be proliferating. And this is in very basic ways, that in order in many countries to get access to care, to welfare benefits, or to reasonable adjustments, as they're called in the UK, in workplaces or education, one has to have an official diagnosis of a learning difficulty or a mental health problem. So there is an entanglement here of different structures within society, again speaking to the importance of mental health and a sociology of mental health being something far more expansive than a subdiscipline associated with the sociology of health and illness, and being related to politics, to welfare policies, to education, to employment, and so on. Okay, next bit. Okay, so our final substantive chapter of reasoning that we draw on in the book and attempt to summarize, and this was really no mean feat, because we clearly could have written a whole book about every one of these reasonings, but this particular one, cultural explanations for mental illness. Many books have been written on this, and we attempted in this chapter to kind of draw them together and to think about them in relation to sociology in particular. Now, this was important because actually within sociology and sociologies of mental health, culture has been relatively neglected. And this is reflected in the kinds of works that we drew on in the chapter on culture and mental health, because we had to make heavy use of anthropology and papers published in journals like Psychiatry, Culture and Medicine, which is often carried out by anthropologists. So sociology's got a funny relationship with culture, one that is shifting in recent years and offers some promise. But historically, the sociology of mental health has not really taken much attention to culture. However, what the work that we drew on and summarised around the anthropology of mental illness underlines that mental illness varies significantly cross-culturally. And this provides a really important kind of challenge to some of the material that we cover in the labelling chapter around the expansion of psychiatric kind of categories, and in particular is drawn on in critiques of the expansion of Western psychiatry in all sorts of global contexts, where if we think about the way in which mental illness experiences and understandings vary in different cultural settings and different global settings, we can really raise very significant questions about whether Western psychiatry should indeed be imposing a DSM-informed kind of diagnostic and treatment regime on people living in different places. However, within global mental health, not critical global mental health, but global mental health, such an approach is seen as increasingly important. So we see this in the World Mental Health Report that I referenced earlier on, published by the WHO, which references that there is indeed a crisis of mental health. And one of the significant aspects of that crisis is that in most parts of the world, people don't have access to mental health care. And when that is phrased in that way, it means access to Western psychiatry-informed mental health care. In the book, we draw on the work of many others, such as China Mills, Arthur Kleinman, and so on, around which have critiqued and questioned the expansion of Western psychiatry, and in particular have shown the ways in which we can see this expansion as being entangled with colonial and neo-colonial geopolitics. So there are long histories and ways in which kind of knowledge and power has been sort of transferred that can help us to understand why Western psychiatry has found its way into so many other places, and why this is seen as a really good thing, even though we might kind of challenge and counter it. Okay, next slide. So within our attempts to kind of summarise and draw on, and in particular take forward cultural approaches to understanding mental illness and understanding a mental illness crisis, we point to the kind of role and relevance of more integrative knowledge, integrative models, which seek to, for instance, draw on biology, society, and culture. So to kind of acknowledge that, you know, biological psychiatry might have something to say, but it needs to be looked at alongside and with society and culture. But where we kind of tended to land and see as more useful, more kind of challenging and helpful is integrative models which look at trying to kind of integrate social and cultural aspects of thinking about the experiences of mental illness, and in particular trying to understand and make sense of that variation in mental illness experience that we referenced in the last slide. So this, Mommy. 1 second. Look. I'm so sorry. That was my small child coming to show me a reading book. Okay, so we particularly focus on the importance of Ian Hacking's work on the ecological niche, which seeks to draw on kind of both social and cultural reasonings around understanding the emergence of mental illness in particular places, in particular times. So this helps us to understand why certain diagnoses may land better in certain places and at certain times, than in others, and why in other places particular mental illnesses may not take off, may not kind of be something that people recognize and make sense of. This offers some ways in which we might kind of start to take seriously the cultural contexts in which mental illness is experienced, given names, and responded to and treated. Hacking's work takes seriously the importance and role of medicine and psychiatry in categorizing mental illness experiences. But it also points to the role of observability and recognition, the visibility and accessibility of those labels. So it speaks really nicely to the material around labeling theories that we also covered. But in terms of thinking about kind of cultural applicability, what Hacking also points to is in the importance of kind of the way in which a type of distress or a form of disorder relates to particular culturally valued or rejected ideals. So this might speak to, for instance, the way in which an eating disorder like anorexia might be, it speaks to a culturally valued ideal among some social groups in the UK, for instance, where thinness is largely seen as a good thing, especially for young women. And being of a larger body is often seen as something that is not okay. And this can speak to why, for some young women where thinness is being valued, kind of a label, a practice, an embodiment of anorexia may be seen as something it is valued. One of the important points here is that the kind of category or the diagnosis and the experience of being and having and being labelled with anorexia, it makes sense within a particular cultural context. Elsewhere, and some interesting work in terms of the way that anorexia initially did not spread so well into a Japanese context that we reference in the book, demonstrates that the cultural context in which a diagnosis, a label, an experience may land or be introduced may not be the same in different places. Finally, just conscious I'm leaving you 1 minute to conclude, Baptiste, apologies. The final part of Hacking's work on ecological niches then speaks to the role of release, and that the kind of expression of a mental illness or disorder and needs to speak to a form of release that is not otherwise available in particular cultural contexts. So again, returning to the example of anorexia, this has been theorized by some as being a way of resisting the sexualization of women's bodies, for instance, and allows women to kind of avoid puberty, avoid being sexualized, as well as adhering to ideals of thinness. So it's in some ways a win-win. Right, final bit on culture. I will go through this so quickly, I'm so sorry. Okay, finally, in terms of thinking about the role of culture in explaining mental illness, we were keen within the book to look at alternative ways of explaining and making sense of mental illness, which might be also understood as cultural. Cultural approaches, and especially cultural critiques of explanations of mental illness, can run the risk of accepting the monolithic Western's models of psychiatry, and at the same time then downplaying resistance, rejection, and the existence of cultural diversity. Thanks, Beata. So in particular, drawing on MAD studies and studies from and work within kind of critical disability studies and neurodiversity studies, what we argue for, along with Diana Rose, is for the potential for much greater collaboration between sociology, lived experiences, and MAD knowledges. And in terms of thinking about culture, not as a kind of a monolithic thing that is then imposed by the West, but actually that within many different contexts, there is protest, there is resistance, and there are alternative ways of making sense. Okay, over to you for the last bit. Sorry.
No problem. I think we are almost on time. So I will be very quick because we already have talked for 1 hour. So all the things that we raised so far, and there is more in the book, are really backed up by many, many studies. And I think that's one of the messages that we have in this book, is that although psychiatry and psychology are much more assertive in terms of explaining mental illness, so tackling some causality, some causal processes in the emergence of mental distress. In the social sciences, we also have much material to draw on and to raise some explanatory leads. And I think that you see that in all the reasonings that we have talked about so far, we end up with quite a comprehensive maybe not a model, but a comprehensive array of explanatory factors of mental disorders in particular, but also of what is called today the mental health crisis. We have many analytical leads that covers a lot of social life. And so we just like to wrap this up. We call for also a sociology of mental health, which could publicly highlight that some social processes are at stake in the emergence of mental disorders, but also concealed by the crisis narrative, because often when we talk about mental health, the way in which mental health discourses are articulated in our societies, at least, it conceals the social aspect of it and the social origins of it. So we can, as sociologists or as public sociologists, draw a link between inequalities in mental health and how mental health services can reproduce inequalities. So we didn't cover that, but we can talk about this in the question. We can show the political implications of emotions beyond stress. We can develop critical arguments around psychiatric and psychological labels, how they diffuse in culture, how they are resisted, etc., etc. And we can frame mental health as a cultural and geopolitical issue. Geopolitical because on the basis of all that Amy has said, it's very important to be aware of colonial processes and colonial issues in today's world, and therefore to reflect on that when we talk about mental health. So I think that these four reasonings, they really provide us with this line of articulation of sociological contributions to the understanding of the mental health crisis. That's all for this talk. And I can also say just one last note, Amy, I think this is our last talk about the book, because since the book has been published in June 2022, we did some book launches, we did some conferences in the UK, in Italy, and the US, and I think this is our last one virtually in Poland. So it has been a pleasure to have this tour with you.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's all for today. Thank you everyone for listening to us.
Wow, we are more honored that we had the chance to hear this last launch, and thank you so much. I can see that we have a very nice composition of participants. Some of you I know, and if you don't mind showing yourself, it would be nice to have this to see you. And please, does anybody have questions to our speakers?
Can I ask a question? Okay. Hello again. So thank you so much for your great presentation. And I have probably several questions, but I would like to raise one issue that came to my mind. And I think while I was listening to your talk, I think Baptiste was the part, Baptiste part, and then Amy, you're towards the end, and about the culture. And when you were talking about the shift from community studies to population studies around the 90s, I was thinking, and maybe you cover it in your book, about the shift towards global health, and whether have you or did you see any correlates with the type of data that's been required by global health scholars and the whole politics of global health data production, and including the metrics and including the evidence-based medicine, that this might be also connected and triggering that hold of like move towards more statistical data and less detail, more overview. So this is one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I'm not sure I can answer. I know that so population studies have been privileged because they probably for technical reasons that were allowed progressively, and researchers had the means to survey more representative samples of the population. But I think that initially, at least, the first studies that are considered to be at the origin of global mental health, and I think there are studies of some specific disorders globally as soon as in the 60s. I think they were conducted in a different context by different types of researchers. Now, I don't know about today. It's true that we haven't made this link. We haven't made this connection in our book, Amy. But I'm not sure about that, because it's true that the population studies we have, like the most famous one, the epidemiology catchment area in the US, is very specifically tailored for to my knowledge for the US population, and examining the different type of inequalities. And I think global mental health studies are less specific in terms of inequalities. They measure more national inequalities. But here I'm really talking cautiously because I'm not 100% sure of what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, actually. Probably one we should have tried to kind of like tie that kind of loop up between the first chapter on social positions, where we're looking really critically at the kind of shift from community to population studies and the losses that entailed, in primarily in like the United States and in the UK. But actually thinking about that, how that plays out in global mental health studies would be it's a really good question. I've got like loads of hunches, but similarly to Baptiste, like I don't want to like talk out of turn because I might be wrong. But I think there is my sense would be that given the tendency within psychiatry, even in a kind of a singular national setting like the UK, to assume that we can kind of extrapolate certain things. And so if we're thinking about especially like this, sociological studies of stress, for instance, they're kind of drawing out a particular way of trying to kind of measure distress, whether that is through a particular diagnostic criteria or through particular types of experiences that then become labeled stress, and then we can put them into our models. There's a tendency to kind of distill what Baptiste and I would argue, I think, are kind of much more kind of complex experiences that are entangled with kind of politics, local contexts, local meanings, and so on. And my sense is that within global mental health, you probably see something similar. But I think specifically that question about community versus population studies would be a really good one to ask a colleague that is more embedded in global mental health than we are. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Justyna, very nice to see you, and Radek. So maybe Justyna first, and then Radek.
Hi, good to see you, and thank you for that inspiring description of the book. I hear about your book already the second time, and I think it's really time I read it. So, but when I was listening to you today, I started to wonder about the issue related to the whole mental disorders, which are very complex, and they are very different in terms of the social component in them. This is not you cannot really say about the same amount of social in any type of social disorder when we think about the different types of those problems with mental health in general. So I wonder, how did you deal with that complexity? And don't you think it's more fruitful maybe to nuance it a little bit and differentiate it? And and go into particular avenues to discover the social components of different particular mental disorders. And saying this, I work mainly in addiction, which has a very large amount of the addiction and substance use problems are related to the social component, and that I can see that way dealing with that and explaining it, it's very helpful. And there is a certain amount of understanding and recognition for the social component of addiction issues within this field. And this is related not only to causality, but also to the social component of recovery, which is very important, and social conditions related to recovery. And that also is where sociology can really explain and support a lot in terms of easing the suffering of many people. So yeah, that would be my little long question.
You want to start, Amy? Or?
Sure. Yeah, I can do. But thanks, Justina. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that we would very much support the suggestion that we could do with having more kind of nuanced and careful examinations of the sort of social context and components, as you put it, of different types of mental disorder. I guess one thing that we would argue in terms of the book, which I don't think is disagrees with anything that you've said, would be that part of that kind of nuanced examination would be to be looking, at the experiences of people within particular social contexts, but also about those kind of broader sort of political, geopolitical, and the kind of broader medical narratives that then shape those experiences and the responses to them. And I think addiction is such a wonderful example of how all of those things can play out in different ways in different places for different social groups. And it is also, I don't know, maybe one case where there's a bit more messiness perhaps in terms of, I'm thinking of people, so some of my work has looked at substance use in the UK setting, and there does seem to be, among addiction psychiatrists, much more acknowledgement about the relevance and role of social contexts. And I think it's really hard to get away from, if you're working with people who are opioid dependent, for instance, many of whom are often living with homelessness and poverty and so on as well. So I think that's a potentially really helpful kind of example for what might be useful with many other forms of distress or disorder or diagnosis, which perhaps we might be more likely to see as not having those kinds of explanations. So I suppose I'm thinking in particular around depression, and I'm thinking about this in particular because of a common narrative that we get in some of my community-based research around suicide and suicidality in Scotland and the UK, which is around the kind of concerns that people have. They're experiencing huge amounts of distress to the point of thinking about or enacting suicide. And often, the contexts that they're living in are really complex, very, very difficult. This is clearly not just a biological problem. And yet the first line of treatment is an antidepressant medication with very little else offered. And so I think it's, so I totally agree, but I think we've got a really long way to go before we get there. So.
Yes, saying this, I was thinking that, I don't know, about the PTSD as very strong and related to social, but also depression, which has a wonderful discussions within the psychiatry field related to the different forms of depression. What criteria measure it? Is it really female depression only? Maybe it's only masculine depression, which is not measured, and so on and so on. So that's quite fascinating. But I also, I read a quite fascinating, maybe more, it's slightly popular book. It's more like a reportage called Hidden Valley Road by Robert Kolker. And this is a story of the history of schizophrenia and the history of schizophrenia research, and wonderfully exploring the interface between genetic and environmental, and also in terms of response. So I think you really, we have work to do for the rest of our lives and forward, but that's, I think it gets very complex and interesting also when you start to dig into particular disorders and conditions. And don't get me wrong, the movement addiction is a brain disease is very strong, and it gets lots of damage and problems related to this. So, but also within the psychiatry, the discourse biological versus social is also very strong. And yeah. Once again, thank you.
I think just to follow up on that, it's also difficult. I mean, ideally, we should have made some distinctions between different disorders, but the problem is that it's difficult to find criteria to do so. For instance, what disorder would be more social than another, or what would justify distinguishing some disorders. I was also thinking that we would have some comments on the fact that we combine any mental disorders with ADHD, and sometimes we talk about autistic spectrum, which is in many regards different. But the thing is that we start from the premises that we study mental disorders as they are socially managed, you know, and so in that regard they are all a little bit social in a way. So yeah, that's I guess that's where we are now, and it's very difficult to find any convincing criteria to make distinctions here.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And I guess one of the things, just to add before we go on to the other question, sorry, is just that I think in the book we do like draw on a lot of more specific examples than we've been able to do in the talk today, which kind of do point to the importance of, and like we kind of unashamedly prioritize qualitative approaches here, where there is a much more kind of engaged approach to understanding kind of social meanings and connecting those to social and cultural contexts. So in the book there are many more examples which I think would further support your suggestions.
Okay, thank you, Radek, and then Kami, please.
Yes, hi. So if I can add something to this discussion, if we are thinking about different contributions of social factors to different disorders, then in a way it implies thinking in categorical terms as these are discrete categories, but the problem is there's really not much good evidence to claim that these are really discrete categories pointing to discrete biological or other kinds of problems. If we rely that to schizophrenia, then, for example, Richard Bental's famous, I should say, book explaining madness shows very well how the meaning of the category changed, how the category was constructed, and how reliable or unreliable it really is. So that's also leads me to my question, which are really three questions maybe, but related. So have you looked at alternatives to DSM or ICD or this kind of categorical nosological systems? For instance, there's the power threat meaning framework proposed recently, which I think emphasizes meanings as culturally constructed meanings that give meanings to this phenomena we're talking to, and then shapes the way we are discussing it or trying to approach it or trying to solve these kind of problems, and that's also in a way connected to the social aspect in terms of something I could maybe call identity politics that is building on the DSM categories and identification with these categories, and also how sociologically this kind of medicalization can work. For example, if you take neurodivergence or ADHD or this kind of diagnoses, then what the impact in terms of economical relations, power disparities, the impact of framing oneself or one's identity with these categories could be on the preservation of the dominant economical system. And have you looked at iatrogenic effects, perhaps, of adopting this kind of identities and the iatrogenic effects of dominating psychiatric treatments?
Thank you very much. I can start answering, and Amy, you follow up on. So the thing is that we mostly discuss categories that are used by the most legitimate professional organizations, like DSM categories, ICD categories, mostly because we try to describe what is and not try to imagine what should be instead, because unfortunately we are only sociologists. But so what we talk about this, about the difficulty to talk critically about something using the name of the most legitimate organization, and a lot of what we cover is related to what we could call the hegemony of psychiatric and psychological organizations in our cultures. You know, the fact that even without the direct intervention of a professional, most people know categories from the DSM, from psychology, etc., and they use them. But still, we evoke some alternatives a little bit. We talk about neurodiversity. I'm not sure we talk about the power threat meaning framework because it's very recent. But I guess I don't know what you think about this, Amy, but I guess the power threat meaning framework is it's a bit funny because they are psychologists and they really like have some statements that are kind of common for sociologists. So in a sense, we can't disagree with them. It's just like I'm very happy that that this happens right now. It's very useful actually. So yes, I don't remember your last question. It was about
basically the impact of labor on preserving the status quo.
Yes, we're talking about we are not talking about the iatrogenic effect, but we are talking about how categories are embodied by people, how categories become identities, and how there is some questions around about performativity, the fact that people try to enact the labels that they embrace in their everyday life. So it's pretty much a sort of equivalent of the iatrogenic, or what is called the iatrogenic effect, I think.
Yeah, so I think you agree. We don't actually go into that. I think many others do and have done, but we focused more on kind of explaining the kind of emergence and ways in which mental illnesses, whatever, are kind of described and then enacted, and not necessarily looking at the consequences of those labels and how they're lived with, which I think that the kind of issue of iatrogenic effects, whether of sort of taking on kind of particular kind of mental illnesses as an identity, or in terms of psychiatric treatment itself, which, you know, again, many others have done really good work kind of demonstrating the significant iatrogenic effects of, you know, medication specifically and inpatient treatment and indeed other things. But that wasn't our focus in the book, for sure. And I guess, yeah, and to just briefly in terms of the power threat meaning framework, yes, I don't think we discuss it at all, although it has come up in almost every presentation we've done, which is, you know, so it's something that people are kind of, even though it is quite novel at the moment, and I think it is still playing out in terms of, you know, potential critiques of that model, whether it's a replacement of like kind of one dominant way of thinking about it with another one just from a different professional group. And I think perhaps for that reason, we might not want to kind of embrace it fully, even though, as Baptiste said, as sociologists, there's not much in it to disagree with. But I think, yeah, in terms of thinking about the impacts of that for kind of the organisation of healthcare and people's identities and so on, I think there's some really interesting stuff there that, you know, in terms of how that's playing out for people living with different diagnoses, and what that might mean for them if they've kind of embodied or embraced a particular diagnostic label that actually they might be okay with. And so anyway, I think it's a really fascinating area, but again, not what we discussed in the book. But thank you so much for. We always do this. We're like, oh, maybe we should write another one. No.
Yes, thank you. There's also a sociological process about the struggles for different ways of describing these things, right, on the level of different organizations and so on. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Radek. We have one last question. Are you ready, Baptiste and Amy? We have still 3 minutes, so Cami, please.
It's perfectly fine. My question was just answered in that response. So yeah.
Amazing. Are you sure?
Okay.
Yes,
okay.
yes. I wanted to talk about the labels as well, and you basically answered my question. Thank you. Thank you for the amazing presentation. I'll use my time to thank you for that.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Okay, so yes, so I guess we made it until the end. If anybody else maybe has the last short question? No? Okay. So I have many questions, but I think maybe let's respect time of each other's and honor your child who wants to show you the book.
Really wants to show me this book.
Yes, thank you so much for this really very rich and inspiring presentation. And thank you also, thanks to all the participants for your input and for your attention. And Małgosia, could you please maybe announce the next seminar? Do you remember the date? Because sorry,
okay, guys.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, and our next seminar, we still don't have a date, but it's going to take place in January, and we hope that Claudia Lang from University of Leipzig, who has done research on mental health in India primarily, will be able to join us. So please look for our emails with the announcement. And thank you so much, Emmy and Baptiste, for again this really inspiring talk, and and these connections between local and global. I think that was really nicely done too. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.